Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. In 2022, the new set of regulations arrived into Formula 1 with the intention that following and therefore overtaking would be far easier in this new generation of cars. That seemed to be the case initially as soon as the cars hit the track last year in Bahrain 2022, but about a year or so later, the drivers are not happy with how they have developed. Hamilton saying that effectively, the new regulations have failed to fully deliver what they were promising. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate loads of juicy stuff to dive into today. Firstly, on the tyre compounds, Lando Norris was very vehement really in talking about the Pirelli tyres that were used in the Melbourne Grand Prix and of course elsewhere this season. A lot of the drivers had issues coming off the line in that final restart with the temperatures in the tyres, getting them in a decent temperature window, not locking up into the first corner as many drivers did. Okay, you can argue driver error, but the Pirelli tyres have been a cause of some controversy, even going into the Baku Grand Prix and even Imola. They're choosing quite aggressive compounds that will degrade quite aggressively, and we've seen in the past tyres blowing up and potential issues as a result for Verstappen 2021, for example. So Lando Norris says these tyres are terrible and do not belong at the top of motorsport, and we need a tyre that feels like it should be on a Formula 1 car. This coincides with rumours the other day that the FIA have tendered the possibility for the return of Bridgestone. These, of course, there used to be tyre wars back in the day where teams would choose between either Bridgestone rubber or Michelin rubber, and it's a bit of a disaster in a way because certain teams, if they had the better tyre manufacturer for that weekend, were basically unbeatable. So from now, it's been Pirelli for a long time in Formula 1 now, but there have been some rumours that maybe Bridgestone want to get involved again, and that would be very interesting to many drivers. I'm sure Hamilton was a massive lover of the Bridgestone tyres back in the day before Pirelli rubber officially came in. So want to keep your eyes on there. Speaking then of the dirty air phenomenon that we're going to dive into here in a second, Yuki Tsunoda says that Hamilton versus Alonso in Hungary was a key reason and a key bit of research he did to improve his own defensive driving skills. I've been looking at videos, I was just watching the way Alonso was doing that, and I learned a huge amount, saying that looking at that Grand Prix has helped Tsunoda defend, and I mean, this poor guy needs to defend, right, because that Alpha Tauri is a tractor, and he is, in my opinion, outperforming that car at the moment. Tsunoda is doing an admirable job, there is no doubt. This, of course, is that Grand Prix weekend between Hamilton and Alonso, where they had a phenomenal scrap in Hungary, and Hamilton on a much quicker car. His car at that time with the fresher medium rubber was probably at least 1.5 seconds, if not 2 seconds quicker per lap than the Alpine, but Alonso was, masterclass, able to keep Hamilton behind for long enough that Esteban Ocon was able to go on and win the Grand Prix that weekend. Yuki Tsunoda's been learning a lot from this, of course, but it must be said that this overtake would have been much easier for Hamilton had there been less dirty air. Hungary certainly a track in the older regulations where the dirty air effect over the course of the lap really meant that overtaking, even if your car was much quicker, was a massive challenge. And it certainly seemed clear when we went there in 2022 that overtaking was much easier around Budapest than it had been in the past. However, Hamilton thinks that this year especially, things have regressed somewhat. So even Franz Tost from AlphaTauri mentions Yuki Tsunoda as a potential candidate to join Red Bull in 2025. I know there's many questions right now. What's going to happen in the Red Bull seat? Perez, yes, he can win races, but he only wins races when Verstappen has a problem. That's been the case so far. I mean, Verstappen's record against Perez is like 33-4, and those 4 are times when Verstappen's had some sort of a difficulty. So, is Perez going to stay there long term? Maybe he will if they keep winning everything, but there comes a time where either Riccardo wants his seats back or some of their junior guys in Formula 2 or potentially AlphaTauri want to step in. So Franz Tost says he's very happy with Yuki Tsunoda. He's approved in every aspect, and he will be ready for the Red Bull in 2025 when the contract with Perez ends. So pretty interesting statement. I do wonder about Liam Lawson, right, who is currently in Super Formula, one of Red Bull's kind of a junior guys. Also Ayumi Iwasa, who I wouldn't be surprised if he gets the AlphaTauri seat next season, because I don't expect De Vries to be able to match Tsunoda over the course of the year, and that certainly hasn't been the case so far. So an interesting future to keep your eyes on there, but it was Carlos Sainz who was the first driver to really mention that the dirty air limitation is back. So the dirty air effect really is exactly the same thing that causes a slipstream in a straight line, but when you get into a corner, the churned up air from the car in front means your wings and your downforce generating equipment on the car is less effective, and therefore you get understeer, you lose time in the corners compared to what you'd gain in a slipstream on the straight. So it's been a phenomenon for years. The more downforce the cars have, the more dirty air they generate in general, apart from the ways that Formula 1 have now with the 2022 regs tried to find their way around that. And, that's why if you watch karting, the racing is phenomenal because there's no downforce, there's no dirty air really. And the more and more you get into Formula 1, the more these issues start to occur. Now, Carlos Sainz said that when he was chasing cars in Saudi Arabia, that dirty air is now again a limitation, going on to say that this year, because the cars have added more and more downforce, this year's cars are probably a second quicker than last year's at the start of last season, pretty much. And, they actually raised the right height of the floor to decrease the effectiveness of the floor, because in 2022, just a quick rundown, they added ground effect back into Formula 1 to enable the wings to be less powerful and therefore less dirty air for the car behinds by generating more downforce through the floor. Now, they raised the floor, made the floor less effective, so the teams have been adding every single bit of additional downforce they can onto the rest of the car, which affects the cars behinds. And Sainz says it's becoming a limitation, it's harder to pass. Now, I think we have seen this in part, especially in Saudi Arabia, when Sainz was trying to get close to Hamilton, then it just wasn't going to happen. He was staying behind. Hamilton, when he got close to Russell, wasn't going to happen. He was forced to stay behind. And the same thing in a way for Fernando Alonso. Whenever Alonso got within 1.1, 1.2 seconds of Hamilton, he was forced to kind of just drop back a bit because the understeer was too much, the dirty air was affecting Alonso in the corners, and Hamilton was able to get back to a 1.7 advantage, even though Alonso reckons, and even Hamilton reckons, that Alonso was probably in the slightly quicker car on the day. He just couldn't get close enough to make any overtake happen, and he didn't have a delta required to make said overtake happen. Whereas with these newer car concepts, with the ground effect and less angle on the wings and less kind of boxiness of the aerodynamics on the car allowed by the regulations, there was meant to be more clean air for the car behind. This, I believe, is the case to a certain extent, but Hamilton says they have not delivered what they promised and have effectively failed in what they said that they would do. So Hamilton says, when asked about the dirty air of these cars, no, it's the same as it was in the past. I think last year for us was pretty bad with the bouncing because you've got the turbulence and the bouncing, whereas this year we don't have the bouncing, talking about the Mercedes, so we have less issues following the cars ahead. I think it's a bit better than the previous generation, but it hasn't delivered everything that they said it would. So got some improvements to make hopefully for the future as well. So interesting statement from Hamilton, echoing what Sainz and Leclerc, and I believe Verstappen also mentions that when Verstappen was in traffic in Saudi Arabia, I think he found it more challenging to follow cars in front than maybe he expected. Last year in, of course, Spa, like Verstappen was flying through the field, no problems at all, didn't seem to really be suffering any issues with the dirty air. But this year, the new cars for the new regulations, they've taken them one step further. Does feel like it's more of a challenge now to actually follow the car in front. So is Hamilton right that the regulations have failed to deliver all that they were made out to be? I mean, I think we saw Bahrain 2022 last year when Verstappen and Leclerc went, back and forth for so many laps. I think it was very clear initially that, the regulations had succeeded, at least from the first eye test, in allowing closer and better racing. But as time has developed, the first few Grand Prix of this season have had less overtakes than one might have expected. Now, Bahrain usually is a banger Grand Prix. This year was pretty dull. You can put a fair bit of that down to the fact that it was, they practiced there as well, so the teams are already relatively well set up for the weekend, so there was no real outliers in qualifying compared to performance in the Grand Prix. But even in Australia, okay, in fairness, over the majority of the hybrid era, the average is only 18 overtakes. Last year's race had 34, this year's race had 29. This excludes like lap 1 shenanigans as well, but over the course of the Grand Prix there were 29 overtakes. Now, there was Perez getting 10 overtakes here, so like if you consider Perez being out of position and if you put him back in position, there wasn't really that much overtaking action on track, and that includes the additional DRS zone which is now in play, because there was 4 here, whereas usually there's only been 3. And obviously it was only a couple of years ago they changed the layout to enable more overtaking down that kind of back curvy straight anyway. So I don't know, what do you guys think about it so far? The Saudi Arabian Grand Prix did have the most overtakes of any Saudi GP that's happened so far, but again, Verstappen started P15 that day, so there was lots of overtaking to be done from him. So yeah, I don't know, I haven't been particularly impressed by watching these cars in the level of, it didn't strike me like it did last year how well these cars are able to race. I do still think it's better. Hamilton says it's better, but it's maybe not good enough to justify all the hype that they were giving the new regulations when they arrived. So what could they do as a result? Raising the ride height of the cars last year and mandating the floors be higher has affected them because the floor is less effective. Therefore, it's the floor that generates downforce without producing dirty air as much as the wings of the car do. So it has meant that the phenomenon has increased more. Whether they can try and reverse that phenomenon in the coming years without making the cars slower is, an interesting question, but there's a balance that's got to be struck here, because if this trend continues going forwards, the drivers are like, well, to be honest, it feels like 2021 all over again when we had complete heavy Grand Prix weekends as to how much the dirty air was affecting cars following from in front. And Ferrari drivers mentioned this in Saudi Arabia. Now Hamilton seems to agree. Definitely intrigued to hear your thoughts on this in the comments section below. Just to close out with, I thought, a kind of remarkable stat here from F1 Stats Guru on the race of attrition that is the Australian Grand Prix. Since 1996, there's been an average of 8 retirements per Grand Prix. Now, since 2014, it's been only 5, but still, it's a very high number. Now, back in the late 90s, I mean, the cars are so unreliable. 13, 12 DNFs. 2008, of course, an absolute madness. 15 DNFs that year. But even since then, you know, there's never been less than 3 DNFs. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 3 in 2022, 3 in 2019. And this year was set to be, what, 2 before Hülkenberg smashed it in the wall and decided that everyone was going to not finish that race after the chaos of the restart. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.